Hello and welcome to Upstack America's Oracle EBS Financials Functional Training. My name is Bob and I'm the lead senior consultant for Upstack America. And with me today I have Victor, who is also a senior consultant. And today we are handling lesson 19 of the receivables module. And Victor, please walk us through.
Thank you, Bob, for the introduction, and welcome everybody to this lesson in our financial functional training series. In this session, we are going to talk about AP and AR netting. Okay. This is something that we might have mentioned before when we were in either AP or AR, and we said how some of these modules interact or applications interact. So AP and AR netting is one of those ways, and that's what we are going to talk about in this session. So what is AP and AR netting? This is a feature that you use when you have a trading partner that is both your customer and is also a supplier. So you have a trading partner who you're buying things from, goods or services, and you're also selling them something, goods or services. So in that case, AP-AR netting can be an important feature with several advantages. So this is a scenario which we can use to explain AP-AR netting. So we have Mascani developers there. Mascani developers has implemented both AP and AR modules of Oracle EBS financials, right? We have Realmat stores here who we are going to make a customer and both a supplier, both a customer and a supplier. So what happens on the AR side, like in the normal day-to-day transactions, you will have us creating transactions in AR when we sell services or goods to Realmat stores. We send them an invoice, or when we create it in AR, it's a transaction. We send it to them as their invoice and they pay us, right? What is called a receipt, which we apply to our transaction. On the AP side, this is when Realmat has sold goods or services to Mascani. So they will send us an invoice, right? And once we enter that invoice, we'll make a payment to them. Okay, so this is we are familiar with this cycle. Okay. So what happens when we have AP and AR netting, or without AP and AR netting? Let's start there. So let's say, for example, we have sold goods or services worth $100 to AP to Realmat stores. So in AR, we will create a transaction outlining all those goods or services that we sold to Realmat. We will print out and send that transaction as an invoice to Realmat for $100. Because Realmat is a good customer, they will pay us $100, which they owe us. On the other hand, we have some goods or services which we have bought from Realmat worth $150. So what would happen is that Realmat would send us an invoice for $150 outlining all those goods or services that you have sold to us, and we would send them a payment of the same amount. So in this case, we have, I could say, 4 documents in total, right? So we have this invoice that we send them, we have this receipt that we get, we have this invoice that they send us, and we have this payment that we send them. So that is in the case whereby we have AP without AP and AR netting. So even from the get-go, you can see how this process can be made easier. It's probably something you would do yourself. If your friend, if you owe your friend $100, but your friend owes you $150, then you tell them, just pay me $50, okay? So that's the same way how basically AP and AR netting will work. So with AP AR netting, our scenario would look like this. Of course, we would send them an invoice would have an invoice for $100, right? Detailing the services or goods that we have sold to them, and we'll have the invoice for $150 detailing the goods that we bought from them. Okay. However, because we already know what the situation is from this slide, then there will be no need for them to pay us $100 and then we pay them $150. Rather, the net would be that we owe them $50, right? So that is the transaction that we'd want to take place, whereby it's a payment of $50 that we make to RealMart stores, and this whole situation is settled, right? When we look at this overall situation, it is that Maskani owes RealMart stores $50. So this is what happens when you run the APR, the netting program. Okay. Of course, what actually happens in the system is this. When you run AR netting, in this kind of scenario, what will happen is that a receipt will be applied to this transaction. This one that we're calling the invoice of in the eyes of RealMart stores is what is a transaction in AR, right? And we apply the receipts to transactions. So what we call a netting receipt would be applied to that transaction, okay? In this case, it would be a netting receipt of $100, right? Meaning that RealMart stores won't be sending us payment of $100. The APR netting program will also apply a payment to this invoice. Okay, we'll create a payment for this invoice for $150, but it will create a payment of $100, meaning we will be left with an invoice or a payables balance of $50, and that is what we would end up making as payment to RealMart stores. Okay. So in a nutshell, what the netting program does is that it creates receipts and payments against invoices or transactions so as to settle accounts between the trading partners. Okay. So, of course, if it was the other way around, then and we were the ones who are to get paid by RealMart stores after all the settlement, then we just have to reverse this process. But maybe that's not the right term to use. What I mean is that it will also work in the case whereby we are the ones who are owed more. So let's say RealMart stores owes us $150 and we owe them $100. So it's just the same thing, just going the other way. That's what I was trying to explain. So bottom line is that APAR netting applies these receipts and these payments to the invoices or transactions. Okay. Now, there's one important thing to note. We already know how these documents work: receipts, invoices, payments. We know for us to be able to create receipts in Oracle or in receivables here, they need to have features such as what? Receipt class and receipt method defined. Receipt method, we know it contains the GL accounts and the bank remittance bank accounts for those receipts. On the other hand, for payment, in order to make a payment, of course, you're making a payment from a bank account. So payments will also have to be associated with bank accounts. So in the same way, these receipts and payments are created by the netting program, they have to be associated with bank accounts, right? And consequently, GL accounts. However, these bank accounts and GL accounts that we create to be used by the netting program they are fake features or dummy features. Okay, so the GL account, which is the netting control account, is like a fake cash account, right? Remember, when we create the bank accounts, we usually enter the cash account associated with it. So in the same way, when we configure the settings for API and AR netting, which includes bank accounts and GL accounts, we have to do the same thing, but those features are going to be dummy features. Okay, so the bank account that is associated with the netting control account is also a dummy account. Okay. Now, let's talk about the accounting that's created when we do this netting process. So in AP, we know that when we receive an invoice from the supplier and we enter it, this is the accounting that's created. We debit our expenses and we credit our payables. Okay. So going back to this scenario, when we receive the invoice from the supplier, all right, this is the accounting that's created. Okay. Now, when you run, okay, in the normal situation, when time comes to pay this invoice, what would you do? You would create a payment whereby you credit your cash and you debit your payables, right? You reduce your cash and you reduce your payables. You're no longer liable for that amount. What about in the case for the payment that will be created by netting program? It's the same thing, only using the netting control account, or what we can call the netting cash, right? So this part here, the netting payment, the accounting created for that will be we debit our payables just like for a normal payment, but we are crediting this dummy account called netting cash or the netting control account. So that's the accounting created from the AP side. What about for AR? We know when we create a transaction in AR, it means we have sold something to the customer. So we debit our receivables and we credit revenue. Okay. When we run AP and AR netting, in this scenario, a receipt is created, a netting receipt to be applied to this invoice or transaction. What does that accounting look like? In the normal case, we would be receiving cash from the customer, right? And we will be reducing the receivables that we expect from the customer. In the same way for netting, I will be debiting this netting cash, which is a dummy cash account created for the purposes of netting and crediting our receivables. Now remember, in our scenario, in the end, we will end up making a payment, an actual payment of $50, because that's what, after all these calculations, we end up owing Realmat stores. So an actual payment for this will be created, whereby this will be the actual cash account and not this dummy cash account, because here we are actually writing a check and sending it to Realmat stores. So that's a real payment. These others they're just dummy documents created by the netting program, so as to settle accounts. So when we want to use APAR netting, there's some setups we have to do. Of course, we have to create that GL account, the netting control account, or what we have called the netting cache. Normally created as a balance sheet account, liability account. Then we have to create a netting bank account. We can associate this with any bank and bank branch because it's a dummy account. When we create the normal actual account in Oracle, we usually associate things such as documents with that account, checkbooks, etc. Since this is a dummy account, we don't have to associate documents with it. Like we said, netting program is going to be creating dummy receipts and dummy payments. So in AR, we have to configure a special receipt class and method for this purpose. In payables, we don't need to make any settings. And then finally, we need to create a netting agreement. What is the netting agreement? Netting agreement really outlines one, who is this trading partner that is both a customer and supplier. It also applies the criteria that are going to be used when selecting the transactions and invoices that are going to be affected by the netting program. So that is what the purpose of the netting agreement is. So these are steps that you do one time, okay? Of course, if you have many trading partners who you want to use this netting feature, you have to create different netting agreements for your partners, right? And of course, if you want to create different features, such as different GL accounts for each agreement or whatever the setup, these are the one-time steps that you'd have to go through. But for every time now you're doing the netting process, which is selecting the transactions and the invoices, these are the steps that you have to follow, whereby you create a netting batch. A netting batch also contains sub criteria for the selection of the transactions and invoices to be picked for netting. Of course, there's the additional criteria contained in the netting agreement. Once you create the netting batch, then you will be able to view a proposed netting report that shows you the transactions or invoices that have been picked for netting for your current process. Once you view the report, you may decide to add or delete some transactions depending on your needs, of course. And once you're satisfied with the invoices and transactions that will be used, then you can submit the netting batch for the settlements to take place, and then finally you can view the final netting report. Okay, so this is the netting process. For every time you're doing the APAR netting, and this is a one-time setup. So of course, these are all steps that we are going to follow. So let's start with our one-time setups. We are going to create GL account that we are going to use as our netting control account. Okay, and we said we are going to create it as a liability account. So this is pretty straightforward. This should be a current session. Let me log out. We know how to create accounts, values in our natural account value set. Excuse me. Can use any of these responsibilities. You already know that too. So we said we want to create this liability account. Let me see, our liability accounts should start from 2000, 2200, 2300. We can put this as 2400. We can call this netting control. Go to the qualifiers. It's going to be a liability account. That's it. Pretty straightforward for that. Something we have done multiple times. Now we need to create a bank account, which we are going to associate with that dummy cash account called Netting Control that we have created. We need to follow this navigation, set up payment bank accounts. Of course, for that, we know we have to be using our payables responsibility. To set up payment bank accounts or not bank account. Okay, so I think our account is called Maskani. Yeah, so what we want to do is we want to create a new account. All right, so we already have this one, which is our actual account that we use. Now we want to create a new one for netting, so we'll click on create. So of course we have to enter the country, United States, bank name, I think our bank is called Bank of North America or something like that. Bank of North America. I think this is Jacksonville. Bank of North America, Jacksonville. So that's our branch. So we are creating our netting account, which is a dummy account under this bank at this branch. So bank account owner, who owns a bank account, legal entity or your trading partner, could be a company or a person. So in the case, I don't know why I say trading partner, bank account is owned by a legal entity. Okay, in this case, our legal entity is Maskani. So we want this to be used for both payables and receivables because we're going to have receipts and payments. Go to next. So we have to enter these details about our new account. We can call this Maskani netting account. Account number. I'm going to keep this as USD. And that should be all the mandatory information that we are required to enter. Save and next. Now, when we create a bank account, we have to associate it with some GL accounts. You can see some of them here. Depending on your setup, some will be, you need to enter some, or you might leave the ones that are not mandatory and not required for your setup empty. In our case, the cash account is mandatory. Now remember, this is the netting bank account. So we are going to be using that netting control account that we created here. $2,400. That's the combination, and we can select, right? So that's the cash account. You can enter these other accounts if they're necessary for your setup. Very important that you select this option that says netting account and say yes. Okay. Otherwise, this netting account will not be available for you to pick on some fields. So let's see here. Don't have any other mandatory fields that we need to enter, and we can save and go to the next page. We have created the bank account. We have associated it with the legal entity, that's the owner. But remember, the legal entity per se in the setting of Oracle is being served by what? By the operating unit. So it is the operating unit needs access to the bank account, and this is what we are doing with this Add Organization Access button. Select payables and receivables. The organization in this case will be what? Mascani Developers Operating Unit. You can end date this access if you want. So you can also enter some of these details here if they are required for your setup. You have payables options. The account is already defaulted down. Receivables options. The netting account is also defaulted down here, so that's all we need for now. Okay, and we can apply this. So this is our bank account, this account number. These are the organizations that have access. These are the users. You can update your access options here. Click on Save and Next. You can create a contact for this particular account. We won't do that for our setup. And we can finish. So the bank account Mascani netting account has been created. Now we have two accounts under this bank branch. The checking account, which we are using for actual transactions, and this one is our netting account. So let's go back to our steps. Now we need to configure the AP and AR receipt class and method in receivables. Receipt class, we have talked about, we know it. Determines what? Processing steps for receipt. receipt method, which is associated with the receipt class, determines the bank accounts and the GL accounts. So let's go to this. Let's follow this navigation to receipt classes. Change my responsibility to receivables. We'll go to setup receipt classes. So this is a special receipt class called APAR netting. It's a seeded class. Okay. So creation method you can't change. APAR. These other methods you also can't change. Okay. So this is a seeded receipt class. We have the APAR netting receipt method associated with it. Okay. So what we need to do is enter the bank account and the GL accounts that are going to be used in the processing for our dummy receipts created by the netting program. So let's go to bank accounts. So we remember this screen, bank name. We only have one bank. We only have one branch. Account name. Now we have two accounts, and we have to pick the Maskani netting account because that's what we want to use. You can see already the cash account there have been defaulted down. We can go ahead and enter the other accounts needed for the receipt method. This is unapplied receipts. We should have unapplied receipts here. Unidentified receipts. And on account. And we have the receivables activities that we created for earned discounts and unearned discounts. So we have our receipt method defined with all the accounts there and the bank accounts to which they are going to be associated. And we can save our work. So we have our class and receipt method configured. Okay. So when netting program creates those netting receipts that it applies to transactions, this is the receipt class that's going to be used, and the receipt method attached to it, this APAR netting. So finally, in our steps, we are going to create a netting agreement. Now, of course, before we create a netting agreement, we say the netting agreement links customer and supplier, who in this case are the same trading partner, right? And that's why we can do this netting. And we talked about some of the things that the netting agreement determines. It contains criteria for transactions that will be selected for netting, and how they are ordered and how they are processed once they are settled. So before we can create our netting agreement, we have to create a supplier who is also customer. We use the example of Realmart stores. In our case, we have created Realmart stores as a customer in receivables. So now we need to go to payables and also create them as a supplier. Okay. Now, before we go there, just to emphasize that the details you enter for these two trading partners, they don't have to be the same. What do I mean? Like the addresses, even the name under which you enter them, it doesn't have to be the same. The link for netting will be created in the netting agreement. Okay, so what do I mean? If we go to, this is receivables. If we go to customers, so we have Realmart stores. Realmart stores has all these details about it, right? Such as the address, of course, the organization name. Okay, so when we are creating Realmart as a supplier, in this case, we are looking at Realmart, the customer. These details don't have to be the same, such as the name or the addresses. The link for netting is created in what? In the netting agreement. So I'm just going to cancel this. And we can now go to payables. Go to suppliers, entry. So what we want to do is to create now Realmart stores as a supplier. Select create supplier. Well, of course, we are going to use Realmart stores as the name, but we could enter anything here, and when we go to the netting agreement, all we have to do is enter the respective names. So I'll keep Realmart stores. That's all we have to enter on this page. Okay. The way we did it is that we usually go and create an address, right? If you remember. So let's create an address. We can say that this is maybe for, I think this is the same address for Realmart. I'm going to use the same address, but keep in mind that the link is created in the netting agreement. These details don't really have to be the same. So Let me enter these details. We can enter the address name, which we can use to pull up this address. We want this to be purchasing payment. Okay. Click on continue. Our address name is actually mandatory. You can just say Realmart Stores. Continue. These are not valid addresses. I'll just continue. We didn't seem to have a problem with this in payables. Do you want to create a site from this address? Let's say yes. Remember the hierarchy for the suppliers. We have the supplier and then we have the supplier site. So we want to create a site, call it Realmart Stores, and give access to Maskani developers, operating unit, apply. Okay. So yeah, so this should be fine. So we have created this new supplier, and we have created the site for them. Now, when we go to the netting agreement, this supplier will also be available for picking when we need to enter the supplier, right? Now let's go and create a netting agreement. This is the navigation in receivables. So we said it was a receipt, netting, and netting agreement. So under this tab for netting agreement, you can search for one. If one is already created, we want to create a new one. So create agreement. Access we are going to give to Maskani Developers OU. Let's give this netting agreement the name Realmart Stores. You can date this agreement and date it. If you want your trading partner, which is Realmart in our case, to approve for the netting batches, the transactions you choose to net, you can select this approval required. Down here, we need to enter the netting bank account. Maskani netting account. So you can see some of the criteria we have here. Do you want the netting program to select only past due receivables transaction? We are going to say no for this. So we want all the transactions that meet criteria to be picked, and not only the ones that are past due. The order rule, due date, we want this to be the way that these transactions are ordered, okay? And it's going to go from oldest to most recent. We are going to leave this that way. You can have the option to net always or net only when your payables are greater than your receivables. In this case, you only do netting when in the end you're the one who is going to end up paying the trading partner. It could end up that they're the one who needs to pay you. So we're going to leave this as net always. For the rule, you can have multi-currency, cross-currency netting, right? We are going to leave this as net within each currency. So receipts and payments will be applied to invoices and transactions which are in the same currency. So net within each currency. Down here, you can select the invoice type that you want to be picked for netting. What are the different invoice types that we have? This is in payables, of course. We have credit memos, we have debit memos, we have mixed, and we have standard. I'm going to just pick standard. You can add another row to enter different another invoice type. In receivables, we have transaction types. Okay. So we created our own transaction type, which we are going to pick here. All right, so up to that point, we should be good. Next. Now we enter the trading partner, who is both the supplier and the customer. So RealMart Stores, the supplier that we just created, you can specify that you want matching to take place for transactions associated only with a particular site, right? So you have multiple sites, then you can pick one site. Customer, same name, RealMart Stores, and for the address for the customer, you can also pick a certain location. This part, it's an address that you can pick for transactions associated with that particular location only to be picked. We're not going to make those specifications. We're going to leave it open, all right? Select next. On this third page, you see all the options that you have selected. You can go through them and see whether you're satisfied with what you have. If you are, select finish. Netting agreement, RealMart Stores has been created. So we have our netting agreement. So we have done all these steps, right? So now we are primed to now see the netting process in action. And that we are going to do in our next session, whereby we are going to create invoices and transactions and then run the netting under different conditions. So we are going to end this lesson there. We have done the theory and the initial setup, and we are going to proceed in our next session. So Bob, unless you have something to add, we can end there.
All right. Thank you so much, Victor.
Thank you.